All right. Deep divers, ready for another deep dive.
Always.
This time we're heading to South Asia to take a look at education in Pakistan.
Sounds interesting.
We've got a pretty diverse set of sources for this one.
Oh, yeah, like what?
So we've got some background from Wikipedia, of course,
Right, of course.
and we've got a report from a research institute that really digs into the challenges facing Pakistan's educational system.
Okay.
And then to round things out, we've got some insights from a U.S. government trade site.
Interesting. So a mix of like academic and more kind of policy-focused perspectives?
Yeah, exactly. And what's really interesting about the trade site is it hints at some potential opportunities for like U.S. businesses in Pakistan's education sector.
Okay, so like a more kind of economic angle as well.
Exactly. And we're going to do our best to synthesize all of these different sources and give you guys a multifaceted view of what's going on in Pakistan.
Yeah, I think that's really important because education is never just about, like what's happening in the classroom. It's also about economics and politics and culture, and all of these things are intertwined.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
so our mission today is to help you understand how Pakistan's education system works, what's holding it back, and where the potential for change lies.
It's not like a big task.
It is a big task, but, we love a challenge.
Absolutely, bring it on.
Okay, so why don't we start with some of the basics?
Okay, oh good.
So Wikipedia tells us that Pakistan's education system is divided into 6 levels.
6 levels.
Yeah, so you've got preschool, primary school, middle school, high school, intermediate college, which is kind of like our community college, and then university.
Okay, pretty similar structure to what we see in a lot of countries.
Yeah, and it's mainly run by the government,
Okay.
but there are a good number of private schools in the mix as well.
And is there a big difference in like quality or accessibility between those two?
That's something we're definitely going to dig into, but first I want to share this really interesting fact that I found. So Pakistan's constitution actually guarantees free education for all children between the ages of 5 and 16.
Wow. That's pretty impressive.
Right, it's a powerful statement about the importance of education.
It is. There's
Yes.
always a but.
As we're going to see, the reality on the ground is a lot more complicated.
I was going to say, it sounds a little too good to be true.
Right, so let's talk about some of those complications.
Let's do it.
One of the big ones is literacy.
Right.
So the literacy rate in Pakistan as of 2023 is 62.85%.
62.85.
Yeah, so that means that almost 40% of the population can't read or write.
Wow. That's a lot higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah, and when you compare that to some of Pakistan's neighbors,
Uh-huh.
like India, for example, which has a literacy rate of over 74%,
Okay.
it really highlights this gap between that ideal of free education for all
Yeah.
and the actual access and quality of education that a lot of Pakistanis are experiencing.
So what are some of the reasons for that gap? I mean, what's contributing to this low literacy rate?
Well, there are a lot of factors at play, but poverty is definitely a huge one.
Right. Of course, if families are struggling to put food on the table, education might not be the top priority.
Exactly. And then there are also cultural norms in some communities that don't really prioritize education, especially for girls.
Yeah. That's unfortunately something we see in a lot of parts of the world.
And then on top of all of that, you've got political instability and conflict in certain regions,
Yeah.
which can obviously disrupt education systems and make it really difficult for kids to go to school.
So it's like this whole complex web of issues that are all feeding into each other.
Exactly. And that's where this Research Institute report that I mentioned earlier really comes in handy.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me more about that.
So it's called Education System of Pakistan: Issues, Problems, and Solutions.
Okay. Straightforward title.
Yeah, very descriptive, and it does a really great job of breaking down the specific obstacles to education in Pakistan.
Okay. And what are some of the key takeaways from that report?
Well, one of the big ones is that Pakistan is lagging behind on meeting global education goals,
Like what kind of goals?
like the Millennium Development Goals.
Oh, yeah. Those were set by the United Nations, right?
Exactly, to improve social and economic conditions worldwide.
And one of those goals was universal primary education, I believe.
Exactly. And then there's also the Education for All initiative.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that one.
So the EFA aims to provide quality basic education for all children, youth, and adults.
Okay, so both of these initiatives are really about making sure that everyone has access to at least a basic level of education.
Right. And the report points out that Pakistan is struggling to meet those targets.
And do they say why that is?
Yeah, they go into a lot of detail about the specific challenges.
Okay, well, let's dive into those challenges then.
All right, so one of the most striking findings from the report is the huge gender disparity in literacy rates.
Oh, yeah, I remember you mentioning that earlier.
So just to recap, the national literacy rate for men is 71%.
Okay.
Well, for women, it's only 48%.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. And, it's not just a matter of statistics.
Right.
This reflects deeply rooted social and cultural norms that often limit opportunities for women.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about access to education. It's about attitudes towards women's education.
Exactly. And how those attitudes can really hold girls back.
So it's like a societal issue as much as an educational one.
Absolutely. And it gets even more concerning when you zoom in on specific regions.
Oh, really?
For instance, in Balochistan, the female literacy rate is just 23%.
23%, that's shockingly low.
It is, and it really highlights the need for targeted interventions in these areas where girls are particularly disadvantaged.
Yeah, because, I mean, a literacy rate that low is going to have long-term consequences for the entire province.
Absolutely. It impacts everything from economic development to healthcare outcomes to political participation.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. And so the report really emphasizes the importance of addressing gender inequality in education as a key step towards achieving broader development goals.
Okay, so we've talked about this big picture challenge of gender disparity.
Right.
But what about the more specific barriers to education? What are some of the things that the report identifies as being major obstacles?
Well, they actually break it down into two categories.
Okay.
In-school challenges and out-of-school challenges.
Makes sense. So let's start with the in-school challenges. What are some of the things that are happening within the schools themselves that are making it difficult for kids to get a quality education?
So one of the biggest issues is the lack of resources.
Like what kind of resources?
Well, for starters, a lot of schools lack basic infrastructure,
Right.
like proper buildings, classrooms, textbooks.
Right. So just the basic physical necessities for learning.
Yeah, exactly. And then on top of that, there are chronic teacher shortages.
Okay, so you've got schools without enough teachers.
Right. And in some cases, you even have schools where teachers aren't showing up regularly.
They're just not showing up.
Yeah, there's a problem with teacher absenteeism in some areas.
Wow. So even if there are enough teachers on the books, they're not necessarily in the classroom teaching.
Right. And then even when teachers are present, the report highlights that many of them are poorly trained.
Okay, so you've got a lack of teachers, and then the teachers who are there might not be adequately prepared to teach.
Exactly. And all of this obviously has a huge impact on the quality of education that kids are receiving.
It sounds like a really challenging environment for both the students and the teachers.
It is, and it creates this vicious cycle where kids aren't getting a good education, so they're less likely to succeed in life,
Right.
which then perpetuates poverty and makes it harder for the next generation to break out of that cycle.
So it's like this intergenerational problem.
Exactly, and it's something that the report really emphasizes the need to address.
Okay, so we've talked about the lack of resources and the problems with teachers.
Right.
Are there any other in-school challenges that the report mentions?
Yeah, there's one more that I think is particularly shocking.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So in Sindh province, there are cases of school buildings being occupied by feudal lords.
Feudal lords?
Yeah, basically wealthy landowners who have a lot of power in those areas.
So they're just taking over school buildings?
Yeah, essentially. And it leaves students and teachers without proper facilities.
Wow, that's just adding insult to injury.
It is, and it really speaks to the historical power structures
Yeah.
that still influence access to education in some parts of Pakistan.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like something out of the past.
It does, but it's a reality for a lot of kids in those areas.
It's hard to imagine trying to learn in an environment like that.
It is, and it makes you realize how much we take for granted here.
For sure.
Just having a safe and comfortable place to learn can make all the difference.
Absolutely. And it sounds like that's a real challenge for a lot of students in Pakistan.
It is, but it's not the only challenge.
Right. We still need to talk about the out-of-school factors.
Exactly. And we're going to get to those right after the break, so stay tuned.
Yeah.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about the in-school challenges that are making it hard for kids in Pakistan to get a good education.
Right. Those are some pretty tough realities.
Yeah, for sure. And now we need to venture outside the classroom and look at some of those out-of-school factors that are creating barriers.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? What's happening beyond the school walls that's impacting kids' ability to learn?
Well, one of the biggest ones is just the simple fact of geography.
Geography.
Yeah, think about it. Pakistan is a huge country,
Right.
and a lot of the population lives in rural areas.
Okay.
So for kids in these areas, just getting to school can be a major challenge.
I can imagine. I mean, we're talking long distances, limited transportation options.
Exactly. And in some cases, kids have to travel for hours just to get to school sometimes on foot.
Wow. That's incredible.
It is, and it's especially tough for girls.
Right, because they might face safety concerns traveling alone, or their families might be hesitant to let them travel that far.
Exactly. So you can see how these geographic barriers can really limit educational opportunities.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's the issue of poverty, which we touched on earlier.
Right. Poverty is a huge factor both inside and outside the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, if families are struggling to make ends meet, they might not be able to afford things like school supplies, uniforms, or transportation.
Right. Or they might need their kids to work to help support the family.
Exactly. So education ends up taking a back seat to more immediate needs.
And then there are also cultural norms that can play a role.
Okay, like what kind of norms?
Well, in some communities, girls' education simply isn't seen as a priority.
Hmm. So it's not just about the practical challenges, it's also about the attitudes towards girls' education.
Exactly. Some families might prefer to invest their limited resources in their son's education.
Right, because they see that as having a greater return on investment.
Or they might worry about their daughter's safety if they have to travel far for school.
Yeah, that makes sense. In a lot of traditional societies, there are these expectations for girls to stay close to home and focus on domestic duties.
Right, and those expectations can be really hard to break.
So it's like all of these factors are working together to create this cycle of disadvantage for girls in particular.
It's really heartbreaking because it means that girls are being denied opportunities simply because of their gender.
And that's a loss for everyone, not just the girls themselves.
Exactly. I mean, when girls are educated, everyone benefits.
Right. Societies are more prosperous, healthier, and more equitable when women have the chance to reach their full potential.
Absolutely. And it's something that I think we need to be talking about more.
Agreed. It's an issue that deserves a lot more attention.
For sure. And it's something that the report really hammers home.
So the report paints a pretty bleak picture of the challenges facing Pakistan's education system.
It does, but it's not all doom and gloom.
Oh, good. I was starting to get a little depressed.
No, there are actually some glimmers of hope in there, too.
Yeah. Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about these glimmers of hope.
Well, one of the things that the report highlights is the emergence of low-cost private schools.
Oh, interesting. So these are private schools that are more affordable for lower income families?
Exactly. They're known as LCPSs.
LCPSs, got it.
And they've been touted as a potential solution to bridge the gender gap in education.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, because they're more affordable, they're accessible to a wider range of families.
Right.
And many of them are specifically targeting girls.
Okay, so they're trying to make education more accessible to the girls who might otherwise be left behind.
Exactly. And there's some evidence that these LCPSs are actually having a positive impact.
That's encouraging, but I'm also a little bit skeptical. I mean, is affordability really the only barrier to girls' education?
It's a good question. And the report acknowledges that it's not a simple fix.
Right. We've talked about all those cultural norms and expectations.
Exactly. So even if a family can afford to send their daughter to school, they might still choose not to.
Right. So it's like, it's not just about making education available, it's also about changing attitudes.
Absolutely. And that's something that's going to take time and effort.
Yeah, it's a long-term process, but I'm glad to hear that at least there are some people out there who are trying to make a difference.
Me too. And it's not just the LCPSs.
Oh, okay. What else has happened?
Well, the Pakistani government is also taking some steps to improve the education system.
Okay. Like what?
Well, for starters, they've increased spending on education in recent years.
That's a good sign, I guess.
Yeah, it shows that they're at least recognizing the importance of education.
Right. But money isn't everything.
True, it's also about how that money is spent.
Exactly. I mean, are they investing in teacher training? Are they building new schools in underserved areas?
Those are all valid questions and ones that the report delves into.
Okay, so what does the report say about that?
Well, it acknowledges that there's still a lot of work to be done,
Right.
but it also points to some positive developments.
Like-
For instance, the government has launched a number of initiatives aimed at improving the quality of teaching.
Okay, so they're trying to address that problem of poorly trained teachers that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And they're also working on expanding access to education in rural areas.
That's good to hear because we were just talking about how geography can be a huge barrier.
Right. And so the government is building new schools in remote communities, and they're also providing transportation assistance to help kids get to school.
Okay, so it sounds like they're at least trying to tackle some of these major challenges.
They are, and it's important to recognize those efforts.
Agreed. I mean, it's easy to get bogged down in the negative, but it's also important to acknowledge the progress that's being made.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think we often lose sight of.
Yeah, it's like we focus so much on the problems that we forget to celebrate the successes.
And speaking of successes, We can't ignore the growing role of technology in Pakistani education,
Oh, yeah. That's something that's really starting to take off in a lot of developing countries.
right? And both the trade site and Wikipedia hint at this digital revolution that's happening in Pakistan.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? What kind of technology are they using?
Well, everything from online learning platforms to educational TV channels to mobile apps.
Okay, so a pretty wide range of tools.
Yeah, and the pandemic really accelerated the adoption of these technologies.
Right, because schools were forced to close, and so they had to find new ways to reach students.
Exactly. And so now, even as schools are reopening, there's this growing recognition of the potential of technology to enhance education.
And what are some of the specific ways that they're using technology in Pakistan?
Well, one example is Teleschool, which is the government's educational TV channel.
Oh, interesting. So they're using TV to reach students who might not have access to the internet.
Exactly. It's a really clever solution, and it's been particularly helpful in reaching kids in remote areas.
Yeah, I can see how that would be really valuable.
And then there's also a growing number of online learning platforms.
Okay, and are these platforms being used by both public and private schools?
Yeah, there's a mix, and there's also a growing market for educational apps.
So it's like this whole ecosystem of digital learning tools is developing.
Exactly. And it's really exciting to see the potential of technology to transform education in Pakistan.
I agree, but I also think it's important to be mindful of the potential downsides.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, one of the big concerns is the digital divide.
Right, not everyone has access to technology or the internet.
Exactly. And so if we're not careful, we could end up creating even greater inequalities.
That's a valid concern, and it's something that the report also touches on.
So what are they saying about it?
Well, they basically argue that technology should be seen as a tool to bridge the gap, not widen it.
Right. So it's not just about providing access to technology. It's also about making sure that everyone has the skills and resources they need to use it effectively.
Exactly. And that means investing in things like digital literacy programs and infrastructure development.
Agreed. And it also means being mindful of the content that's being delivered through these digital platforms.
Yeah. Right. We need to make sure that it's high quality and relevant to the needs of Pakistani students.
Yeah, it's not enough to just throw technology at the problem. We need to be thoughtful about how we use it.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think we're still figuring out as a global community.
For sure, it's a constantly evolving landscape.
And it's one that we're going to keep exploring in future deep dives.
Looking forward to it.
So we've talked about the challenges, the glimmers of hope, the role of technology.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
But there's one more really important aspect of education in Pakistan that we need to address.
Okay, and what's that?
Gender.
That's a big one.
It is, and it's something that we've touched on throughout this deep dive.
Right, we talked about the gender disparity in literacy rates and how cultural norms can limit girls' access to education.
Exactly. But I think it's worth taking a deeper dive into this issue.
Agreed. I mean, it's such a fundamental aspect of the education landscape in Pakistan.
Absolutely. And so that's what we're going to do after the break, so stay tuned. All right, deep divers. So we spent the last two parts really digging into the complexities of education in Pakistan.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
We've explored the challenges, the opportunities, the role of technology.
And of course, the ever-present issue of gender.
Exactly. So I thought it would be good to kind of take a step back and reflect on what we've learned.
Yeah, sounds good. Like, what were some of the key takeaways for you?
Well, one thing that really stuck with me was that statistic about the female literacy rate in Balochistan.
Oh, yeah, 23%.
It just really highlights the stark disparities that exist within the country.
It does, and it makes you realize that national statistics can sometimes mask these really significant regional variations.
Exactly. And for me, it just kind of brought home the human cost of these issues.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but behind every percentage point, there are real people whose lives are being affected.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individuals. It's about families, communities, entire regions that are being held back.
Yeah. It really underscores the importance of education as a foundation for development.
For sure. I mean, without a basic level of education, it's so much harder to escape poverty, to access healthcare, to participate in society.
It's like this ripple effect that spreads throughout the entire community.
Exactly. And that brings us back to gender, which is, this constant thread throughout this whole conversation.
Yeah, it seems like gender inequality really permeates every aspect of Pakistani society, including education.
And it's not just about access to education. It's also about the quality of education that girls are receiving.
Right, we talked about how cultural norms can lead to girls being steered towards certain subjects or career paths.
Yeah. or how they might face discrimination or harassment within the school environment.
It creates this really uneven playing field.
It does, and it really limits the potential of so many talented young women.
And I think that's what really struck me about that whole Dr. Brides phenomenon.
Oh yeah, that was fascinating and kind of heartbreaking at the same time.
It is. I mean, you have all these highly educated women who could be contributing so much to the healthcare system.
But instead, they're often pressured to stay home and raise families.
It just shows how deeply ingrained these traditional gender roles are.
And how much work still needs to be done to challenge those norms.
Yeah, it's going to take a concerted effort from all sectors of society to really shift those attitudes.
But I'm optimistic that it's possible.
Me too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a growing awareness of the importance of girls' education.
And there are some really inspiring individuals and organizations working to make a difference.
Yeah, we didn't get a chance to talk about all of them, but there are some really innovative programs out there that are empowering girls and breaking down barriers.
Absolutely. And, one thing that really struck me throughout all of this is the resilience of the Pakistani people.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Despite all of these challenges, there's this real sense of hope and determination.
I felt that too, like a belief that things can get better.
And a willingness to work hard to make those changes happen.
Exactly. And, we saw that in the government's efforts to improve the education system.
Right. They're investing more in education. They're building new schools. They're trying to train teachers.
And we saw it in the rise of low-cost private schools.
Yeah, those LCPSs are really filling a critical gap.
And we saw it in the embrace of technology.
Right. Pakistan is really at the forefront of using technology to expand access to education.
And while there are definitely some challenges with that as well,
Yeah, like the digital divide that we talked about.
it's still really exciting to see the potential of technology to transform learning.
It is. It opens up so many possibilities.
And that's what I love about these deep dives.
What's that?
They always leave me feeling inspired and hopeful.
Me too. It's like a reminder that even in the face of really complex challenges.
There's always something we can do to make a difference.
Exactly. And sometimes it's just about starting a conversation.
Sharing information, raising awareness.
And challenging ourselves to think differently.
Absolutely. And so on that note, I want to leave you all with one final question to ponder.
Okay, hit me with it.
If you were in charge of improving Pakistan's education system,
That's a big one.
where would you start?
Wow. That's a really tough question.
It is, but it's one that I think we all need to be asking ourselves.
Because ultimately, it's up to all of us to work together to create a world where every child has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Well said. And that's a wrap on this deep dive into education in Pakistan.
Thanks for joining us, folks.
Until next time, stay curious.